Hi, I'm Kay Whitt, designer for Serendipity Studio, and today I'm going to walk you through the process of adding a set-in sleeve to a garment. Set-in sleeves seem to be something that some people are really afraid to do, and once you have a technique down, they're really very easy to do with a little bit of practice. So I would like to talk about what a set-in sleeve looks like. So I've got some examples here in the studio. One of the first ones that I've got is a wrap dress. Now this is made with quilting cotton. And quilting cotton is one of the easiest to stitch with. The easing of the sleeve into the armhole seems to be a pretty easy thing for most people to master, and it's where I recommend that you start if you're new to this technique. The next example that I have is a raw silk. And raw silk is wonderful to set a sleeve into because the fabric is a rather open weave and the easing happens pretty easily, to make light of a pun there. And then the last one here is a linen. This is a metallic linen, and this metallic linen is probably the most challenging of the three samples. So I would advise in working with this type of fabric that you make sure that you have your technique down perfectly before you use this kind of fabric. So let's get started. I've got my sleeve cut out and I've got my tissue still attached. The reason the tissue is still attached is because you'll notice that there are notches along the sleeve cap here. So the double notch normally indicates the back of the sleeve, the single notch is the front, and then there's a notch here to mark the center. It's really important when you're setting in a sleeve to remember to mark these because the sleeve is really bigger than the armhole. And there's a reason for that. When you're wearing a garment like this, it's very fitted, and if there is no ease between the sleeve and the armhole, it's uncomfortable to wear. So we want to be sure that we get that easing, that extra fabric, distributed evenly into that armhole so that it is a comfortable and enjoyable garment to wear. So I've already snipped my notches here, so I'm just going to go ahead and remove the pins and we'll get the sleeve seam stitched. So we'll remove that, and I'm just going to grab this top sleeve here. This sleeve will be folded right sides together, and we'll go straight over to the serger to serge this seam. And I'm just going to stitch the length of this. And now we're ready to go to the sleeve board. A sleeve board is a great accessory for your studio. I highly recommend having one. I'm going to go ahead and turn this sleeve right side out. One of the reasons I love a sleeve board is because when you go to press your seam, you can slide the sleeve right on. And I'm making sure that my seam is off to one side. And I'll just give that a press. And it's great because now I can focus just on that seam and I don't have to worry about creating that crease along the top of the sleeve cap. Sometimes that's a desirable look, sometimes you don't want it. So it gives you the option. So now this sleeve's ready to be set into the bodice, and here's my bodice. This is actually another wrap dress. So you want to be sure, I'm going to turn this wrong side out and take my sleeve, and I have to make sure that this is my single notch. I want that against my front armhole. So I'll slip that inside, and now what I want to do is line up my side seam and my sleeve seam, pin that, and then I'll find the top of that sleeve cap, line that up with the shoulder seam, and then you would think that you would want to go ahead and pin the whole sleeve in. You don't want to, because remember I said that sleeve's a little larger than the armhole, and you don't want to do that. So I'm just going to pin a little bit to either side of that side seam along the bottom of the sleeve, because that part I don't have to worry about easing. And now the sleeve is ready to be stitched. So we'll go to the sewing machine. And note that I'm using my free arm today. Free arms are wonderful for setting in a sleeve because you can slip that right onto the machine. Now note that I've got the bodice facing up. That's really, really important when you're setting in a sleeve. And the reason why is because the feed dogs are more aggressive in feeding the fabric through, and you want that extra fabric to be against the feed dogs rather than on the top. If you put it on the top, you're guaranteed to have puckers, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So I'm going to start at the side seam here, and we're going to do a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So let's go ahead and get started. And one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to take my left hand and I'm going to put it between the bodice and the sleeve. That's going to help me ease these 2 layers of fabric together. So, stitch here, and we're going to back up a little bit. And stitch along here. And here's where this comes in. Notice how I've got more fabric here than here. So using my left hand, I'm going to begin easing that fabric in. And you'll see it along the raw edges over here on the right side. And I take my time on this part because you want to make sure you get it right. But you have to be mindful of how much you've got up here, because you don't want to ease so much that you run out of fabric on the bottom side here. So I'll just keep going along. And I can see now that I'm going to match up, so I'm just going to get those edges a little closer together there. And get my hand under there again and move this on around a little bit. Raise my presser foot just for a second. There we go. Okay, now that I'm past the midpoint, I'm going to start really focusing on easing again. And let's see here. There we go. All right. This takes a little bit of time, and you have to be patient with yourself because you probably aren't going to stitch the first one in perfectly. This is actually a technique that my aunt, who worked in a clothing factory for many, many years, taught my mother, and my mother passed this on to me. And it beats the heck out of putting easing stitches in, because a lot of times that invites the puckers you're trying to avoid. So that's one of the reasons why I really love this technique, and it just, once you have it down, it really just works perfectly. Okay, that stitching's complete. And so what I'm going to do is show you how magically that fabric has just married to the bodice. There's no puckers. I mean, it's just, there's just no other word for it. It's just magic. So we'll pull all these pins out, set those aside, and now this sleeve is ready to serge. And you can see why, with that technique, why I couldn't just serge the sleeve in, because it doesn't really allow you to do that kind of easing. So now I'm going to go over and serge the seam, and we'll be ready to press. So we'll come over, and you've got to be careful to keep the parts you don't want under the serger out of the way. Just gonna serge this seam, and you can see that easing right there in the sleeve. Yeah, let's see here. Okay, almost finished with that seam. I'm going to show you how it looks all finished here. Okay, here's how it looks. It's all finished off. And now we're going to do some pressing. Again, this sleeve board is fantastic for this application. I'm actually going to flip over to the wider side now. And I'm just going to slip it on here. What I like to do is get my hands under there and feel for that seam to be sure it's turned toward the bodice. And I just work my way around. And you can see how nice and smooth that is. It just, and let's move it on around here. Just work your way around, and really you just have to be patient with yourself. When I was learning to sew, this was probably one of the most challenging techniques for me personally, because I like to sew a million miles an hour, and I had to learn to slow down and stitch it right, and then I didn't have to stitch it several times, because as all of us feel the same way, no matter who I talk to, if you have to take the stitches out, you're not happy. So here's what, let's see, let's get this turned around here. Here's what the sleeve looks like from the outside. And you can see how nice and smooth and just perfect and professional that it looks. And then on the inside, again, it's just nice and finished the way it should be. And that sleeve, pressed in that manner now, will just have such a perfect, perfect finish. And this is quilting cotton, so that was the one that I recommended earlier in the segment that you start with. I think that's the best way to go. And then you can move on up to the other fabrics that I had mentioned. What you will find on these kinds of sleeves is that the taller the sleeve cap, the more ease there is, because the more fitted the design, the more you need the ease for room. So it really is important for you to remember that, keep it in mind that open weaves are just easier to work with. And so that's a set-in sleeve. I hope that these techniques are something that you can use in your studio and make your sewing happier.